I was on my final deployment as a ranger when Sandy Hook took place, and I was overseas watching the world at home rip itself apart over a tragedy, at the same time seeing the fear and the concern and the arguments of gun control rise to the surface. And this is, in a sense, my own story, my own narration of something that has been taking place in some sense long before I was here, and in another sense, a view of time that sees arguments used over and over and over again despite being defeated. If we were to think of the life of the mind and politics and philosophy as sort of a game of chess, or even moves and actions played to disable or destroy opponents' arguments, it would be we would expect that idea of progress. In fact, the idea of the Enlightenment and rationalism, or rationalism as the ultimate goal, would suggest this idea in the academies that once a bad argument is defeated, it can't come back to life. But what we witness in human existence and in politics and in the rhetoric around these ideas is that just because you defeat an idea in a decisive battle of a von Clausewitz style argument, it doesn't mean that it won't come back. In fact, the reason why you can't defeat communism, or you can't defeat certain ideas in an ultimate or decisive sense, is that they prey on not even lesser sensibilities, but they prey on not only weaknesses, but the malice and the wickedness that is inherent to mankind. And if you know who I am, you know that I hold a worldview that mankind is fallen, particularly because of sin. In fact, we have brought it upon ourselves. And so one might ask the question, if you cannot produce a decisive victory in defeat of gun control, why would you talk about it? Why would we have a conversation? Why would I put forward another episode, or this episode, on why I don't agree with whatever is being referred to as gun control? And the genomes of it, the different ideas. There are certain arguments that although they were presented and betrayed in a sense in 2013, we're seeing them arise again. Joe Biden has, in his own words, said, or the current president has said, that he has done it before and he'll do it again. And the issue is that there are decisions that are made, especially in politics, particularly in American politics, that have a perennial nature. They go away, they come back, they go away, they come back. And so why would I produce this? Well, it's not necessarily as if somebody, I'm not putting this together, I'm not saying this as if somebody who is on the other side is going to end up on my video or end up in this podcast listening to what I'm going to say and going to change their mind. Rather, I think it's much more important that you, the viewer, and again, I suspect that most of you who have been listening to this podcast for some time now recognize we have a similar worldview. I believe that we have a similar worldview, and that I'm not really here to argue against somebody else. Rather, I'm here to give you tools, particularly intellectual tools, philosophical tools, for understanding some of the arguments that you might face. And so I was originally planning on releasing a review of the Palmetto State Armory M110 clone, but after reviewing the footage, it's not good enough. In other words, my footage that I recorded earlier is not good enough to honor what Palmetto State Armory has done with their M110 clone, or their Saber 10 line. And so I'm going to have to rework that, because it deserves better production value from me. They deserve that for what they've done. And so that's just kind of a hint. And so comments aside, conversations aside on that subject, let's get into the meat of the subject. Gun control arguments, arguments in support of gun control, or the quote-unquote conversation on gun control, tend to follow in certain, let's call it genetic lines, or certain strains of thought. And I've categorized 4 of them right now that are very common. You see them in social media, you see them in propaganda, you see them in media posts, particularly from specific parties, known parties, whether it's Moms Demand Action, or another example, I'm reading a book called Enough, which is supposed to be by Mark Kelly and Gabby Giffords. And these types of arguments arise again and again and again, and they are so consistent, so easy to identify, that I wanted to give them titles, and I wanted to give you some tools in understanding what the argument is, what are the implications underneath it, and why they're, or not necessarily why they're being wielded, but what are the issues with the argument. In other words, when you're faced with this strategy, if this is an ambush, what is the proper counter ambush? How do you counter these types of arguments? And the first one, and the most easy one, is the statistical argument. And the statistical argument will say something like, the highest cause of death in young adults is gun violence, or the highest. The argument is usually something kind of generic, as in they'll present a bunch of statistics, and they'll say things like, well, America has this much more gun violence than any other country, or the thing trying to be targeted is bad because it's statistically less performative than somebody else. In other words, they're providing statistics in saying what it is that is going on, and that is that guns are used in this many violent crimes, or it is not used in this many attempts to deter violence, or it is it's causing this many deaths. And the problem with the statistical argument is that it is a trap by implication. It's a trap by implication, because, or in the very sense that by the way that the argument is framed, you are expected to follow in suit with their prerogative. It's the evaluation of the information that's the problem. And so if someone can come out and say, well, the statistics say that X percentage of people suffer from Y problem, then we should do something about it, and we can do something about it by instituting these controls. The problem with the statistical argument is it fails on moral grounds. In other words, it has 2 different veins that essentially it has 2 different veins where it produces a problem for you. And the first one is that statistics resides in the realm of is. This is what has happened. These are the stats. This is the context for what is going on. But what it doesn't tell you is it doesn't tell you is the implied moral argument underneath. You have access to the information, but you are being fed the evaluation of that information. And so it presents itself as not even really as an authority, but it presents itself as an argument that because we can show these statistics, therefore we ought to do that. And where it goes wrong particularly is, even as simple as it stands, it goes wrong in the exact place that it presents its solution. In other words, it implies that the existence of statistics justify the actions being presented. And the weakness of it is in that justification. Let me be more clear. If we say that America has a problem with gun violence, and then we show statistics, where are you measuring gun violence? Where are you measuring it? In fact, the statistics themselves can be gerrymandered, or they can be altered, or even to a more nefarious intent, adjusted in a certain way. Not even adjusted. In other words, like you change the definition, and we'll use an example of mass shootings. The definition of a mass shooting is 4 or more injured or killed. In some senses, or in some cases, it's actually 3 that are injured, or that 3 people were present. And the issue then is that the statistic itself is no longer reliable because it has not been very clear on what its definition is. You've seen this happen with organizations in recent history where they've changed the definition according to their statistics. I'm sorry, they've changed the definition without telling you what they're using as the definition, and then recorded a massive spike. Imagine saying something like, a mass shooting is an event where somebody arrives at a location using a gun to do violence and ends up in the death of 4 or more people. And in that statistic, are you including the perpetrator? Yes or no, because let's say a man goes to a place or a person decides to do something that is evil, and he does the evil. He goes and he starts killing people, and then somebody stops him with a firearm. Well, that's technically violence because one person shows up with a gun, starts shooting people. Somebody else responds and shoots him. Now you have four people that are killed because the perpetrator, the criminal, or the perpetrator of the violence killed three people, but then was killed himself by another person with a firearm. That counts as four people killed. Another example, or another, so in that example, in that case, you have a problem because that would be then considered a mass shooting. And even if we could statistically show the likelihood or potentiality of certain outcomes, that does not imply that the morality is determined. In fact, it is dependent on a moral argument. So statistics are actually not useful in a gun control argument for or against, because particularly on the sense that they do not begin with the moral framework upon which those statistics provide context. We believe in moral laws, but it is the actions of people, which is the statistics, that allow us to adjudicate certain decisions. And if we are not forthright with the moral laws first, in other words, that a person has a right to bear arms, or that a person who is under duress being attacked, life or limb, or life or bodily harm, has a right to defend themselves. If we don't begin with those moral outcomes, then the statistics mean nothing. And so the statistical argument that is presented in support of gun control is, if nothing else, the most classic sense of smoke and mirrors. But that is only the first genome. And the response to a statistical argument is, by what standard? By what standard are the statistics being measured? And by what standard is the outcome being implied? The problem with a statistical argument is that it is ineffective in producing any sort of change one way or another unless the conditions in which the moral conditions in which those statistics contextualize are portrayed. And you see this in a very simple standpoint. It is that, oh, well, X amount of people have died by gun violence, therefore we should take away guns. And you're like, well, the implication is that there is a threshold somewhere in the world where you could reach that statistical point and then justify a moral action afterwards. The next genome, the next one is if it just saves one life, and this is a moral imperative argument. And the trouble with it is that we've seen this multiple times before. If we were to take away guns from citizens or further restrict them or challenge their right to bear arms or even make it a burden of finance and effort to even acquire one, then we might save one life. And there are two strains or two ways that this goes wrong. And the first one is that, in most simply phrased, at what cost? If we were to implement a chip or some form of slavery over mankind where they did not have free will anymore, but no one died, would that be moral? In other words, if you could save a life, at what cost? And this is something that's oftentimes replicated in movies and video games and stories in that sense. But it's also a fundamental moral question as to what is the liberty cost for the utility of saving a life, or even the moral imperative of saving a life. If you save one life but it costs 1,000, is it moral? If you save one life, but at the cost of the liberty of your citizens, is it moral? And if it's not moral, then it is not just for a government to instigate it or even integrate that into its legal system. The other issue, though, and perhaps a little bit more, it's not necessarily soft, but it's a little bit more, I think I have to use the word nefarious, is that if it is to challenge the idea that the action suggestion would even save a life, and we use this one actually somewhat more often, and that is, well, gun criminals don't follow the rules anyway. I mean, it's already illegal to murder. Why would you then go forward and ban something else? But there's actually a deeper issue to this one, which is that the conditions upon which are not even the conditions. What we see in mankind is that the more the more control they are subjugated to, especially control that they don't have agency within, the more likely they're going to lash out in violence. Take cornered dogs or caged animals, or even the examples of humankind, is that when you implement controls over them for the purpose of some sort of unachievable utility, and yet then they find themselves incapable of acting in their environment, they are more likely to act out in violence. This happens in a very simplistic sense when you strip a man of his agency in any environment. He does not have the options available to him. He cannot move, he cannot operate, he cannot function, he cannot survive, in a sense, so desperation takes place. But the problem with this one too is what happens when you put that desperation upon him. I think it was it might have been, well, it's not who, but it's you look at yeah, we'll go into this one. Barbara F. Walters talks about how when people lose status, or they lose, let's just call it power, which is a little bit too vague a term for this definition, but it's about as useful as I can get to it right now. When you take somebody who a group of people that have participation in their community, they have let's call it even agency, or even franchisement, and you start taking that franchisement away from them, they're more likely to respond in violence because you have stripped them of their participation in their own community. And gun control does exactly that, is that you are taking somebody who is an adult, who participates in his environment, who willingly bears the moral responsibilities of being engaged and understanding his environment, and you tell him you're not good enough to do that because of some arbitrary dint or because of some utility argument. And then what are they left with is when they're faced with challenges and they're faced with not necessarily oppression, but when they're faced with problems, their response is going to be to potentially, in a counter-utilitarian sense, responded violence. And so the argument of if it saves just one life fails on two grounds. First of all, there's no way to even argue that it is successful. And the second one is that at what cost? If you could, again, prevent anybody from ever committing murder, but they have to, at the cost of agency, not only would it fail on the utility argument, because what we see in human patterns, but also it would fail on a second layer, which is at what cost. At what cost is your utilitarian outcome of quote-unquote saving lives going to produce? Which leads to the third one, which is a little bit more utilitarian in its sense. You don't need something. You don't need an assault weapon. You don't need a firearm. You don't need large capacity magazines. You don't need a semi-automatic. The problem with need, again, is a twofold argument. First of all, when arguments about you needing something are presented, the first issue that they fail on is basic history. The history of liberty, even through John Stuart Mill and going forward, the history of our philosophy of liberty, of rights, of freedom, of any sense of liberty, it completely denies this idea. The idea that one person could decide that another person needs something with no responsibility to the outcome, in a sense, is fundamentally immoral. The idea that one person gets to choose what another person needs is an affront to the idea of liberty. In fact, need, while we might talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the needs of the individual, need is something that has been determined, understood philosophically, or in a sense, through history of philosophy and conversation, something that we recognize that no one gets to determine what another person needs. If I get to determine what you need, then you don't have agency, but I have agency over you. So the utilitarian argument that you don't need something, it runs aground on the history of philosophy and even how we understand rights. The second part about it, and the second part that it fails on, is need implies that there is an outcome, or it inserts itself as whatever the outcome is. Take, for example, the gun control argument. You don't need an AR-15 to hunt a deer. It's not really... It's a trap. The whole idea of you don't need something is a trap, because you have to then argue. You're now forced, in a sense, to argue why you need something, usually with a dishonest interlocutor. But we're going to skip that apart and assume that the interlocutor is honest. The appropriate response to "you don't need" is that no one person gets to determine what another person needs. We believe in freedom. We have agency. As soon as you start determining what another person needs, like a father does to a child, then that person recognizes that they have ownership or they have responsibility over something. And so it's not even responsibility. Those words are not correct. Let's be more specific. The only people upon whom I determine their needs are people who I also am responsible for their well-being. And so if I have the authority to dictate a person's needs, then I have the responsibility to their outcome. And what you have here in the argument of the utilitarian argument against the ownership of firearms is that you don't need a certain thing. The problem is that it does not succeed on moral, metaphysical, and in broader sense, philosophical grounds. It is in fact saying that I am greater than you. If I get to determine what you need, let's just say I'm an expert, quote unquote, which we'll get into, which is the last example, the last genome. But the utilitarian argument of you don't need a firearm fails on moral grounds by implying that one person has the clairvoyance, the something that gets to determine what another person needs. In fact, it struggles, it fails on moral grounds because it asserts itself as somebody being superior by dint of their position or perhaps their status. So the utilitarian argument of not needing something, not needing a high-capacity magazine, not needing a semi-automatic firearm fails particularly because it is not appropriate for someone to determine what somebody else needs. You are the agent in your own life. You make your own decisions. You have your own expenses and costs and decisions to make. And so it is your responsibility as an individual to live morally and fulfill those duties. And while you may seek out the advice of somebody else, it is not their authority to determine you to act so or act as such. And this falls into the question of what is the objective, what is the purpose, what is the place, what is the plan, what does government do, and what does the will of the people do? And I will just return to John Stuart Mill. And this is a paraphrase. It would be no more appropriate if the 99% could oppress the will of the one than it would be if the 1% could oppress the will of the many. And so democracy is out. Individual responsibility and liberty is in. And so this leads to the last one, which is the experts say. And this is the easiest one to debunk, to disassemble, to tear apart. And that is that whenever let's just use a little like a short phrase. Whenever something like assault weapons bans or experts are implied on the use of force and violence, whenever we see this in political talking points, very often the expert himself is not only not an expert, but there are 100 people more qualified, if not 100,000 more qualified than him, according to their own statistics, their own arguments, not statistics, their own arguments, their own conditions, that would outvote his issue. This is the simplistic fallacy of the appeal to authority. And just because somebody is an expert doesn't mean everything that they say is true. And the problem with this one, and you see this every once in a while in American politics, where particularly somebody in support of gun control will look for a expert, somebody who's a veteran, a special operations guy, and they will take that expert and they'll use that person as a authority on a subject, particularly on firearms. And the problem with this one is that it's the weakest of arguments, but it's also the funniest to see, particularly in the sense that most often when you encounter somebody who is being propped up as an expert in support of gun control, who claims to be a veteran, when you look into his record, he's either a stolen valor candidate or he has been grossly exaggerating his value, or even further, even within his community, he is disdained. And so the issue is, and if we were going to talk about experts, is that you have plenty of experts. You've got veterans, you've got people who have been shooting competition for decades, you've got people who know these firearms, even the manufacturers themselves, but all that expertise is disregarded for the sake of a kid who skipped school, who was not there to witness the violence that happened to people that he knew. And expertise is a challenging subject because it itself is not a foundation for an argument. And I present these genomes, these four genomes, the statistical argument, which is in one part philosophically the is versus the ought. In other words, I can give you all the numbers, but I'm not giving you the method of evaluating those numbers. That is what the statistical argument produces. Is it gives you a bunch of statistics, things that happened, the is, but it implies what the ought ought be. In other words, it is forcing an implied moral framework upon you through the use of statistics without admitting or accepting what that framework is. And the simple understanding of it, not simple in derogatory sense, but simple in even my own phrasing, is that you can give me all the statistics you want, but if you're not going to present your method of evaluating those statistics, then they mean nothing. They mean nothing to me in the sense of us having a conversation. The second one is if it saves one life, which is the moral imperative, and it fails on two accounts. First, not only do attempts to quote-unquote save a life regularly fail or it has no value, but second, at what cost? At what cost are you going to, quote-unquote, save a life? If you were to condemn all mankind to slavery for the sake of saving one child, would it be justified? No, it wouldn't. The third is the utilitarian argument. You don't need something. You don't need X. You don't need a large capacity magazine. You don't need semi-automatic. You don't need a suppressor. The problem with this one is, how dare you tell me what I need? Not only in this context, like I am the expert in this sense, if you want to go down to the fallacy right away, but how dare you tell somebody else what they need? They know what they need. They are participating in their environment, unless they are coming to you asking for advice. But I never asked you what I needed. In the gun control argument, I never asked Joe Biden what I needed for my firearm. And then the last one is the appeal to authority, which is experts say. And this tip is is actually the most fun to engage in, particularly because either the expert is proven not to be an expert or their expertise is weak, or a second part is who cares. It's not really like experts. The idea of an expert is to give advice, not to give authority. And if we were to engage in the meritocracy of the argument, you're going to find out that all the people who are the most qualified are somehow not a part of the conversation. Why aren't people who have been shooting competition for decades, why aren't the people who have been fighting wars for decades, why aren't the people who know the differences in the firearms and stuff, why are they not being brought forward? Why are they not the experts? Rather, the experts are people who skipped school and got a degree at Harvard for merely existing while your president was a plagiarist. And so, that being the case, these four genomes of gun control arguments were brought to you for the sake of your edification, so that you can stand secure in understanding what you're doing is right or true or good. Or if you can investigate them, you can investigate the truth. And with that, I must close. So, go forth and conquer.